The door would not open. Charles Ching stood in the gathering dusk of November, his hand upon the latch of his own house, and the wood did not yield. His farmhand waited behind him, silent. Inside, the rooms were dark. No lamp had been lit. No kettle sang upon the stove. His wife had not returned. His children had not called out. And when he broke the window and climbed through, he found them arranged upon the floor, covered with a sheet, a Bible resting above their still forms. What had happened at Alligator Creek? Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you are from and what time you are watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let us begin. It was Friday, the 17th of November, 1911, in the remote settlement of Alligator Creek, some 20 miles distant from the town of Mackay in the state of Queensland, Australia. The air hung heavy with the scent of sugarcane and damp earth. Rain had fallen in the night, and the roads were soft with mud. Upon the vast expanse of farmland, corrugated iron dwellings stood scattered across the landscape, separated by miles of green cane fields that stretched toward the horizon. In one such dwelling lived the Ching family. Charles Ching, a man of Hong Kong descent who had arrived during the gold rush decades prior, worked the land with his wife Agnes, who had been born in the English town of Burwell. They had 6 children in total, though only the 4 youngest remained at home. The house was modest in the extreme. It possessed a dirt floor and walls of thin iron sheeting. The kitchen stood separate from the main structure, connected by a short path worn smooth by daily passage. The family employed a single farmhand, a young man of 27 years named George David Silva. He had been born nearby, the son of immigrants from Ceylon, and had known little comfort in his life. On that Friday morning, Charles Ching announced he would travel to Plain Creek Mill for supplies. He would be gone most of the day. What awaited his return would shatter the quiet of Alligator Creek forever. George David Silva had worked for the Ching family for some months. His duties were simple enough. He tended to the cane, repaired fencing when required, and performed whatever labor the season demanded. He slept in a small shed at the edge of the property and took his meals separately. His wages were modest, paid at irregular intervals when Charles Ching made the journey to town. The young man harbored ambitions beyond his station. He had confided to neighbors his intention to marry Maud Ching, the eldest daughter, a girl of 17 years. He spoke of acquiring land, of building a house, of establishing himself as a man of property. The neighbors had listened with skepticism. One had replied plainly that he possessed no money, no blankets, no decent trousers. How would a girl consent to such a match? The Ching family had rejected his proposal outright. Maud herself had refused him. The matter, it seemed, was settled. On that Friday morning, Charles Ching departed early. The sun had not yet burned away the mist that clung to the cane fields. Agnes Ching rose and prepared breakfast for the children. The 2 eldest, Edward and Dolly, would walk to the Alligator Creek State School. Maud would remain at home to assist with the younger ones. Hubert was 5 years old. Winifred was not yet 2. The house followed its customary rhythm. Washing was hung upon the line. The stove was tended. The day progressed as days do, marked only by the ordinary tasks of a farming household. At some hour between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, gunshots were heard by neighbors across. The fields. This was not uncommon. Farmers shot at hawks that threatened the chickens, at snakes that appeared near the houses. No particular attention was paid. The afternoon heat pressed down. The cane stood motionless in the still air. When Charles Ching returned near dusk, his cart laden with supplies and his farmhand's wages, he found George Silva waiting outside the locked door. The house was dark. No smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Silva explained that Agnes had taken the children to visit a neighbor. Charles Ching found this strange. Agnes did not leave without informing him of her plans, but he retreated to the kitchen and waited, believing she would return presently. The hours deepened. She did not come. As darkness fell, Charles Ching's unease transformed into alarm. He instructed George Silva to accompany him, and together they walked to the neighbouring properties. At each door they inquired after Agnes and the children. At each door, they were told the same. No one had seen them. No one had received a visit. The children had not appeared that afternoon. They returned to the darkened house. Charles Ching stood before his own door, uncertain. The window shutters were closed. No light showed through the cracks in the walls. He called out. No answer came. He tried the door again. It remained locked from within. Something was profoundly wrong. He instructed Silva to hold a lantern high while he broke one of the windows. The glass shattered easily. He climbed through, his boots meeting the dirt floor. The lantern light fell across the room in fragments. Then he saw them. Agnes lay upon the floor, her body positioned carefully. Beside her was Maud. The two younger children, Hubert and Winifred, had been placed next to their mother and sister. A sheet covered them. Upon the sheet rested a Bible, its leather binding dark in the lamplight. Charles Ching knelt. He drew back the covering. Agnes had been shot. Maud had been shot. The smaller children bore the marks of violence about their heads. They had been battered, perhaps thrown against the wall. Their small bodies were still. The scene possessed a strange and terrible order. The bodies had been arranged as if for mourning, laid side by side with an almost ceremonial precision. The Bible placed deliberately. The sheet drawn over them with care. Yet beneath this arrangement lay the evidence of brutal force. Blood had spattered across the shutters. The walls bore stains. The children's faces were marked by injury. Charles Ching dispatched his farmhand to the nearest property to summon help. Communication was difficult. The telephone lines were discovered to be severed. George Silva was provided with a horse and instructed to ride to Mackay to alert the constabulary. He departed carrying a bundle with him, though he did not ride with particular urgency. When he eventually arrived at the police station, he informed the duty officer that he believed the crime had been committed by bushrangers. By then, however, the officer had already been alerted. Someone had managed to send word through alternative means. Inspector Sweetman arrived with several constables within hours of receiving the communication. They entered the house by lantern light and examined the scene with grim efficiency. The bodies remained as Charles Ching had found them. Blood had dried upon the floor. The shutters bore evidence of gunfire at close range. Items had been disturbed. A watch belonging to Charles Ching was noted as missing. The officers worked through the night documenting what they observed. The positioning of the bodies suggested deliberation. The killer had taken time after the violence to arrange them, to cover them, to place the scripture upon them. This was not the work of panicked bushranger. Passing through. This spoke of familiarity with the household, of knowledge of who would be present, of calculated action. At dawn, 2 of the Ching children remained unaccounted for. Edward and Dolly had not been found within the house. Their school bags sat upon the table. They had returned from school then. But where had they gone? Search parties formed. Neighbours joined the constables in walking the fields and the narrow paths between properties. A native tracker named Charlie Dion was summoned. His expertise proved essential. He found footprints leading away from the house, across the fields, toward a more remote section of the property. The prints were clear in the soft earth, a single set of boots, an adult male. The trail continued for more than a mile. At a distance of approximately 1.5 miles from the house, the bodies of Edward Ching and his sister Dolly were discovered. The boy had been shot. His sister had been beaten with severe force. They lay where they had fallen, half concealed by the tall cane. The footprints continued past them, then circled back toward the house. On the following day, Dr. William Poole, the government medical officer, conducted post-mortem examinations. He confirmed that Agnes Ching and her daughter Maud had died from gunshot wounds. The 2 youngest children, Hubert and Winifred, had succumbed to injuries consistent with severe blunt force trauma. Edward had been shot. Dolly had been beaten. 6 lives extinguished within hours. The doctor signed the certificates and forwarded his findings to the authorities. The house was sealed. Constables remained posted at the property. The investigation had only begun. Detective Sergeant Thomas Head arrived from Townsville to assume command of the investigation. He possessed considerable experience with criminal matters and approached the case with methodical attention. He reviewed George Silva at length. The farmhand's account contained inconsistencies that troubled the detective sergeant. Silva claimed he had been shooting at a hawk with Charles Ching's rifle during the afternoon. He stated he had then rested beneath a tree near the railway line, yet when asked to identify this tree, he could not do so. When pressed about the specific timing of his movements, his answers shifted. He suggested that a migrant worker might be responsible. This worker was located and questioned. Multiple witnesses confirmed his whereabouts throughout the entire day. The suggestion proved baseless. A schoolgirl named Grace Curry provided testimony that proved significant. She recalled seeing George Silva on the afternoon of the 17th of November. He had been wearing khaki trousers and a blue shirt. He was speaking with the Ching children near their home. Yet when Silva arrived at the police station that evening, officers had documented that he wore dark trousers. Small details accumulated weight. Silva eventually confessed to destroying clothing. He claimed the garments had been stained with animal blood. He stated he feared being wrongly implicated. He led officers to the location where he had burned the items. Among the charred remains, investigators found a revolver. Silva claimed he had purchased this firearm in Brisbane. Charles Ching identified it immediately. It had belonged to his wife Agnes. The footprints discovered near the bodies of Edward and Dolly Ching were compared against Silva's boots. The match was exact. The pattern was identical. The size corresponded precisely. Detective Sergeant Head believed sufficient evidence had been gathered. 5 days after the murders, George David Silva was taken into custody for further questioning. If you are finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let us continue. As news spread through the community that Silva had been detained, anger mounted. Crowds gathered. There were calls for immediate justice. Fearing violence, the authorities moved quickly. Under sustained questioning, George Silva confessed to the murders. In his confession, he implicated 2 neighbours, naming them as accomplices. Charles Butler and Dudley Khan were brought in for questioning. Investigators found no evidence supporting Silva's claims. The neighbours possessed alibis confirmed by multiple witnesses. Silva had acted alone. The charred clothing, the missing watch and the weapon were transported to secure storage. Formal charges were laid. He was remanded to custody to await trial. In March of 1912, George David Silva was brought before the court to face the charge of willful murder. The proceedings attracted considerable public attention. Reporters filled the gallery. Citizens from across Queensland travelled to witness the trial. The courtroom in Brisbane was filled beyond capacity. The weight of 6 deaths hung over every word spoken. Silva was charged with a single count of murder, that being sufficient to carry the sentence of death under the law. The prosecution presented their case with precision. They argued that the defendant's motive stemmed from rejection. He had sought to marry Maud Ching. He had been refused. His resentment had festered into violent intent. Witnesses testified throughout the proceedings. Neighbours from Alligator Creek provided accounts of Silva's behaviour and statements. Peter Anthony recalled a conversation in which Silva had spoken of making trouble if trouble was made with him. When asked what form trouble would take, Silva had replied that he would likely kill some of them. The statement, recorded months before the murders, carried terrible significance in light of subsequent events. The evidence was presented item by item: the charred clothing, the stolen watch found among the burned garments, the revolver belonging to Agnes Ching, the footprints matching Silva's boots precisely, the inconsistencies in his statements, the false accusation of the migrant worker. The defence contested each point. They claimed their client had been coerced. They alleged the confession had been extracted through violence while in police custody. The prosecution countered that Silva had not been under arrest when he made his statement. He had spoken freely and willingly. George Silva chose not to testify in his own defence. His lawyers argued for his innocence, but the accumulation of evidence proved overwhelming. Judge Lucan delivered his summation. The jury retired to deliberate. 20 minutes passed. They returned with their verdict: guilty. Judge Lucan asked if the defendant wished to address the court. Silva rose. He turned to face the jury. In a clear voice he proclaimed his innocence. He maintained he had committed no crime. He spoke with conviction, his words measured and deliberate. Judge Lucan pronounced the sentence: death by hanging. Silva displayed no reaction. His face remained composed. He was led from the courtroom. An appeal was lodged. The Executive Council reviewed the case. They determined that the law should take its course. The Ching family was buried together in the Mackay cemetery. 6 coffins were lowered into the earth on a day of heavy rain. Charles Ching stood beside the graves, the sole surviving member of his household. Neighbours attended in considerable numbers. The children from Alligator Creek State School stood in rows, their faces marked by ink. Comprehension. How does one explain such violence to the young? The service was brief. The Methodist minister spoke of mercy and of heaven. The graves were filled. Within weeks, headstones were erected. The names and dates were carved into the stone. Agnes Ching, aged 45, Maud Ching, aged 17, Edward, aged 9, Dolly, aged 7, Hubert, aged 5, Winifred, not yet 2 years old. The newspapers carried extensive coverage. The Brisbane Courier published detailed accounts of the trial. The Mackay Mercury printed editorials about the tragedy. Public opinion divided. Some believed Silva had been driven to desperation by poverty and rejection. Others saw only the calculated brutality of the crime, the arrangement of the bodies the Bible placed upon them as some twisted gesture toward redemption. The Methodist Church, where Silva had been a cherished presence in his youth, offered prayers but no defence. George David Silva was held at Boggo Road Gaol while his appeal progressed through the courts. He was attended by a spiritual advisor during his final weeks. He spent considerable time in prayer. He maintained his innocence throughout. On the 10th of June 1912, he was taken from his cell in the early morning. He thanked the prison officers for their kindness. He stated once more that he had received no justice at trial. He went to God, he said, with a clear conscience. He was led to the gallows. The executioner made his preparations. Silva began to recite the 23rd Psalm. His voice was steady. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The trap was opened. The drop fell. Death was recorded as immediate. He was 28 years old. His body was buried within the prison grounds in an unmarked grave, as was customary for the executed. Years passed. The house at Alligator Creek fell into disrepair. Charles Ching did not remain on the property. He could not. The cane fields continued to grow and were harvested by other hands. The corrugated iron dwelling eventually collapsed, reclaimed by weather and time. The Alligator Creek State School closed decades later. Its students dispersed to larger towns. The graves in Mackay Cemetery remained tended for a time, then less frequently, then not at all. The names on the headstones weathered and became difficult to read. The case was referenced occasionally in legal texts as an example of circumstantial evidence properly applied. The file remained in the Queensland State Archives, bound in ribbon and stored in darkness. Few remembered the name George David Silva. Fewer still remembered the Ching family. The sugarcane grew tall where the house once stood, green and swaying in the wind that came in from the sea.